A new book reveals many layers of St. Louis history. We'll have details next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. NiNi Harris has written something like 14 books about St. Louis history and architecture, and this is her newest. This used to be St. Louis. NiNi Harris, welcome to City Corner.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Maybe I should say welcome back.
Welcome back. It's always a joy to be here.
You've written like 14 books. I don't think I've interviewed you about all of them, but quite a few of them over the years, right?
Correct, yeah.
This new one is just out, and I would just want to read you the first sentence of your
Okay.
introduction. I'll kind of let you expand on it a little bit. The first thing you say in your introduction is, St. Louis history is revealed in the bricks and mortar of its buildings, in the pavement of its streets, and in the landscapes of its parks.
Oh, and that's just true. Every feature of this city has an evolution to it, a story behind it. And that story is a puzzle piece in this vast and complicated history of our city. It can be the people who laid the bricks, what ethnic group they were, when they came here, why they came here. It could be just why that street was built where it was built. Mm-hmm. And our parks reveal so many stories of our history. For instance, one was a cemetery. Another had been a brewery site, and it was turned into a playground. The vacant brewery was torn down, and it became a neighborhood playground in a very crowded neighborhood.
Well, this is of interest to you because you're a native St. Louisan. You're a descendant of immigrants, German, I think, right?
Well, Germanic, one part. Well, because we had so many people from all over Eastern Europe, they were called Germans even if they weren't German.
Is that right?
Well, German was the common language. They were called German by outsiders. Like if you were in Soulard in 1910, this guy, we knew he was Polish, but how could he communicate with the neighbors from Bohemia? The German language. So outsiders thought all these people were German, but German was the shared language. My grandmother really wasn't, she was only part German, but she learned English in kindergarten because she grew up in Soulard.
I think I've told you this before. My grandfather, I'm of German descent on my mother's side, St. Louis, and my great-grandfather came here right before the Civil War when he was 14 and moved to Soulard and later to Lafayette Square and other places. But we've talked about that before, our St. Louis background.
That St. Louis history, yes, and I think your family had a mill very near St. Mary of Victory's Church.
Well, Saxony Mill, which was at Choteau on Broadway.
Yeah.
And then my great-grandparents had a dry goods store downtown, Utah Gasoline and Draga, and a whole bunch of other things.
Uh-huh.
A Brower supply company, which was where the Loft District was, and it was out at the new Cortex place. I think they might have torn the building down.
Amazing? Now, I didn't know that, but I come across your family's ancestral names in early records or mid-19th century records of St. Louis.
Right.
I found them repeatedly.
Why are you so interested in that? Not just me, but everybody's St. Louis history.
Well, how can we know who we are if we don't know our stories? And I was lucky enough to grow up in an old urban neighborhood when much of my peer group was growing up in suburbs with nuclear families. I lived in an old neighborhood with Nana, Grandma upstairs in the second floor flat, and with grandmas up and down the street who all would tell their stories. And you were in absolute awe, of their tales. And the other thing is the inspiration. When we think things are tough, oh golly, all we had to do was listen to one of their stories.
Oh, and you mentioned your grandmother. What about going to school? What did you say, speaking English?
She learned English in kindergarten in Soulard.
My grandmother, who was born in St. Louis in 1891, went to only German-speaking schools her entire life in St. Louis.
Well, that's interesting because it's in the schools that they learned English. So it may have been that she was in a school that they had German and English, but how do you teach children math in a foreign language? How do you teach a 6-year-old math in a foreign language? My grandmother started kindergarten not knowing any English, and thank goodness they had kindergarten, because how would she have learned basic spelling and reading?
I bet our ancestors like bumped shoulders at farmer's market once, like 100 years ago or something.
At Soulard.
Don't you think?
At Soulard Market, and your ancestors probably saw Ulysses S. Grant selling firewood in Soulard.
Wow. Never quite
There's a
thought of it that
very
way.
good chance of that.
Well, your book is This Used to Be St. Louis, and the whole premise of it is you take a look at places that we know today and you let us know what they were originally.
That's right, because each one of them has a unique story. I am constantly dumbfounded by the layers of history here, and it really struck me some years ago when we were traveling and we were out on the Chisholm Trail, and we went to this one little town, fascinating history related to the Chisholm Trail. And then after that, it ends. It just ends. There's the story. Whereas St. Louis keeps reincarnating itself, and its buildings and streets keep getting new uses. So you look at one of our buildings, and I'm sometimes challenged of, okay, which layer of the history am I going to share about this building? Which part of its story? Because the story of one building could fill a book.
Why don't we just begin and look at
Okay.
one of the images from your book, and you can give us an exact idea what you're talking about. Now, what's this?
Oh my goodness. Well, that is Big Daddy's Bar and Grill
That's something that's there now.
at 10th and Sydney. Lots of people know Big Daddy's. It's a very popular Soulard gathering place.
Is it fun?
Absolutely. But I'm so enthralled with its history. Now, it was built in 1897 by an American brewing company that was located here. So the building is already 120 years old. But before that building stood there, that was Anton Yeager's Beer Garden. That whole area around that, that's the core. That was the center of Anton Yeager's Beer Garden.
Which was a business.
It was a
was
business.
a bar.
It was a private. It was an outdoor park. It was a private park where you paid for the park by buying beer, and you got to enjoy the environment. But it had a very significant role in our history. It is on high ground, not far from what we now know as NGA on South Broadway, but that was the old Federal Arsenal.
Oh.
And that's what the secessionists wanted to get control of in the spring of 1861. There were enough arms there to equip a small army. Well, at that beer garden, lots of Southside Germans were secretly meeting when they were supposedly just enjoying beer and music, and they were drilling, and they had 1,000 muskets stored, hidden from secessionist force in St. Louis. Wow. So you go to that place and you think, my goodness, this was a secret army, an armory for a small army of volunteers, the Home Guard, that were committed to preserving the United States of America and committed to abolition. And that's where they secretly met. So when you're having a beer at Big Daddy's, you are in a progression of people who had beers at their corner and discussed politics and the survival of our nation.
So we can honor history by drinking beer. I like that idea.
You sure can. It's a noble thing to do.
Let's go to the next image from your book, This Used to Be St. Louis. Now, that's, I'm just guessing Forest Park because of the water.
No, it's Shoto's Pond.
Oh.
It's an old postcard of Shoto's Pond, which extended from the Metrolink station for Busch Stadium. It wandered all the way to Union Station. And it was part of a little creek that runs into the river at the Mill Creek pumping station at the flood wall. And in 1767, a French settler dammed that creek at the Metrolink station, that was the location at the dam, to power a mill. And then Shoto bought that mill, and it created this pond when he dammed it. So it became called Shoto's Pond because he bought it, or Shoto bought it. And it was idyllic and lovely, but then you started to have industrialization, and it became polluted. So after the epidemic, the cholera of 1849, they thought it was polluted. And the pollution perhaps spreading the disease, so they drained it. And it left this big open area that was kind of flattened out by the pond for decades on the southern edge of downtown. And so when the railroads get built, where do you build the railroads to be near downtown? You follow the path of Shoto's Pond. This is in the 1850s. They start
Did it
building.
go back, like behind Union Station, that area? Did it go that far?
Behind Union Station, it went over right where the rail beds are today.
And isn't that what they called Mill Creek, which was the
That's
African-American
right.
area?
That was a little, yes, absolutely. But Mill Creek extended all the way. The rail beds, the creek extended further than the pond itself. But yes, that's the history of it.
You know, you've said before that St. Louis keeps reinventing itself. What do you
Yes.
mean by that?
Well, we keep finding new purposes. If you think of it, we started as a fur trade outpost. We become the gateway to the West. We tie together the North and the South in our river and system and our role as a transportation hub. We play a major role in saving the United States in the Civil War, something that's really not explored or understood often. And then we become this industrial powerhouse that just doesn't funnel goods west, but we make the brooms that the pioneer women used to sweep out the sod houses. We make the fabric. We make the cast iron stoves that they used to heat the bunkhouses out west. And we're absorbing waves of immigrants, and they're going to work in all these factories and mills that are powering the West. And then the role we play in mobilizing for World War I is so significant. Then we absorb waves of immigrants or migrants from the South. After immigration is closed in 24, waves of migrants from the South, black and white, come here and find work and become part of a middle-class America.
Makes you wonder what's next.
Well, maybe it's the technology. It's happening.
Startups
we
now,
don't
right?
know it, right?
We're a place for startups.
And who knows what else is happening?
Right. We need to take a break, NiNi, but we're talking with NiNi Harris about her new book, This Used to Be St. Louis. And you can get it at Reedy Press, reedypress.com, or you can go to NiNi's website, NiNiHarris.com. And we'll be back in just a couple of moments. Stay with us.
Behold, the angry giant. Behold, the angry giant. Behold, the angry giant. Behold, the angry giant. It only takes a moment to make a moment. Take time to be a dad today.
Here's your check. Oh, you got it. You know, since I got rid of my car, I really enjoy walking.
Okay.
God, no.
Getting pulled over for buzz driving could cost you around $10,000 in fines, legal fees, and increased insurance rates.
Oh, you're home early. You live with your mom?
That'll set your game back a few years. Buzzed, busted, and broke. Because buzz driving is drunk driving.
This used to be St. Louis. That's our topic today on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter, and this is NiNi Harris's new book, and she's here. And you know, NiNi, we're going to look at some more images of your book, which identifies places we know today in St. Louis, whatever business or whatever might be there, and then you explain what it was originally 100 years ago or 120 years ago or whatever it was. And early in the book, you mentioned stuff about the Arch Grounds and how that was a forgotten warehouse district.
Yes.
And that's so appropriate now that the Arch Grounds have just reopened after all that renovation as a national monument and all that. What do you think of what they've done down there?
Oh, it's so exciting. At first, I was very hesitant, and frankly, I didn't want any changes. But they have so comfortably made it more accessible. And by raising the height of the boulevard at the river's edge, they make that so much more usable. Of course, if we have a really, really severe flood, that will flood. But otherwise, it will be usable for festival space. And before this, we couldn't do that because it automatically flooded in
I haven't
spring.
been down there yet, but I'm anxious to see the whole new entrance and everything, and the view is supposed to be really great.
Yes, and how it shows the arch as part of the city. And that is wonderful.
All right, let's delve back into the history of St. Louis with This Used to Be St. Louis with another image from NiNi's book. And who are these young people?
Oh, well, they are the Polish dancers from part of the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. There were about 3 blocks of the Mount Pleasant neighborhood.
Where was that?
That's in the southern part of Dutchtown. It's right around the corner of Itasca and Compton. And that pocket there was developed as a Polish village between about 1904 and 1906. And it was a little pocket that was undeveloped between Dutchtown and Carondelet. And a Polish immigrant who was a fireman, he mortgaged his home. He took that money and bought 2 blocks of land, full blocks, undeveloped. And then a Polish priest, an immigrant priest, subdivided those blocks and sold it to Poles who could not find housing in other parts of the city. And they created a village, and they built a St. Hedwig's Church in the middle of it.
We all forget, but back in those days, how segregated we all were from nationalities. You know, the Germans lived in one place, Polish in
Right.
another, and whatever.
Well, and I don't even look at it as segregated. They needed to support one another in translating American
Yeah, they weren't doing
culture.
it in a negative way.
No,
Right.
and it made for a very rich environment because you walked a few blocks and you'd be in an area that had a different character and a different mood, and there would be a sausage shop that had Polish sausage.
Yeah, you even talk about, there was a Chinese area downtown somewhere.
Yeah, where the Spire, or Lickley Gas building is, that was designed by Philip Johnson and built in the mid-1970s. That was the site of Hop Alley, which was the center of the center of the Chinese community of St. Louis. And it was not big because the Chinese were scattered because they ran laundries throughout the city. And they needed to be near their customers. But on Sunday afternoon, they closed their laundries and they would take the streetcars to Hop Alley, and there they had Chinese restaurants and businesses that catered to them. And they had places where you could buy fine Chinese embroidery and soaps and all for their businesses and teas.
Huh. Let's look at another image from your book.
Oh, that's one of my favorite. That is the entrance to the very fashionable lofts at 2020 Washington. And people knew that building as the sporting goods store, sporting goods offices. But it was really built in 1919 as the Emerson Electric Building. Emerson Electric was founded in downtown in 1890. It was a booming business making Emerson fans and what we call Casablanca fans. They had so much business, they were turning away oodles of business.
We could use those this summer, by the way.
We sure do. What we do, they created that fan. They were fabulous. But that's where the ball turrets for the B-17s were built in during World War II, and the B-24 bombers.
Wow. Let's check out another image. This used to be St. Louis. We're looking at what's here today and what it used to be then.
This 1024 Mississippi, a house built as rental property by a brewer named Joseph Snader. And in 1918, it was bought by Albanians and turned into an Albanian Orthodox church.
Wow.
And it was that until 1935. And now it's restored as a home again. It's right across from a wonderful shoe factory, or a building built as a shoe factory that's now the Mississippi Lofts.
Right. Let's go to the next one.
Oh, Evangeline's Bistro in the Central West End.
I've never been there.
You got to go. And the inside, it has this beautiful look built in the teens. It's like from the images from the silent movies, you know, with the stucco and the Mission Revival. And inside is all this beautiful woodwork and tile floors.
But I know your book's going to tell us what that was originally.
It was built as a Pierce Arrow dealership.
That was a car dealer.
A car dealer. And it was built by a fella son of Irish immigrants who came here from New York, who talked his way into running a popcorn stand at the World's Fair, used that money to make his way into a garage business, then had this, and he invested $200 in a group called the St. Louis Cardinals.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, and by 1919, he owned them for 27 years. Wow. Sam Braden was his name.
Oh, what year was that building built in?
It was, it's built in stages, 1913, 1914. The back part, which is 2 stories, was built
I guess they were
later.
selling cars that early, right? 1913.
Yes,
yeah.
Isn't that extraordinary? And they sold them in buildings. They didn't have the big car lots like you see today.
Well, in fact, that place in Grand Center, that ice
The
cream.
Fountain.
The Fountain was a car place too, wasn't it?
Yeah, Bear Stutz, a more sporty
The
car.
Fountain on Locust.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's right. That was the car, and that was part of Automotive Row.
Right.
And people took the streetcar to Locust and walked up and down the street and looked in the windows to pick out cars.
Let's look at another image from your book.
Hammond's Books in Cherokee, 1939 Cherokee Street, and it was built in 1889 by German immigrants. And Mr. Rosina Keller and Protus Meyer, her husband, he worked at the breweries, and she turned the first floor storefront into a boarding house for brewery workers, German immigrant brewery workers. Huh. And then he lost his job and she lost her business with Prohibition. But there's some evidence to suggest they found another way of making money, that perhaps they were brewing beer in the basement during Prohibition.
Did that really happen? I'm being
Well,
sarcastic.
I know they were fine, law-abiding people otherwise, but people did not accept Prohibition.
Right. You're not going to slander anyone in your book, are you?
Nah.
Okay. Let's go to the next image, take a look. I recognize that place.
On Lindell Boulevard,
That's part of St.
3700.
Louis, you know, isn't it?
It's the St. Louis Shoe Admissions Building. I just love that building. Now, when I went to St. Louis Shoe, it was a place of great mystery.
Why?
Young people were coming to and from it and coming and talking to the students, like myself, asking us if we wanted a free personality test. And they were missionaries from someplace we had never heard of, the Church of Scientology.
Uh-huh.
And they had bought the building and used that as their base of operations.
It was originally a home, though, wasn't it?
It was built in 1890 by an English immigrant, Alexander Houston, who was a very successful businessman. He was the president of Collier White Lead Paint Company. And then in 1912, at that point, the street was all grand homes. In 1912, it becomes a boarding house for single working women who want to be somewhere with a sense of community. It was called the Queen's Daughters.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you one thing. We were talking about downtown earlier. There's a story behind the Metrolink tunnels. I wonder if any people know that.
Oh my goodness. The Metrolink tunnels were the result of Chicago interests trying to stop us from bridging the Mississippi.
Right.
And they, through the state legislature in Springfield, forced the bridge to be at the north end of downtown. And our rail beds were at the south end of downtown where Choteau's Pond had been. Mm-hmm. And that would have meant that trains would be going through the heart of the business district, spewing smoke and sparks, fire hazards. They thought that killed the whole project of bridging the Mississippi. But James B. Eads came up with the idea of building the tunnel, which is now the Metrolink tunnel.
You know, I can't help but think, NiNi, and we've just hit the tip of the iceberg in your book of all the, I don't know how many entries you have in here. 100?
Not quite. It's where the publisher stopped me. So there'll be a volume 2 because I'm still going at it.
That's where I was going. I was wondering about, of all the things you found out, how many other stories we don't know yet?
Oh my goodness, I'm ready for volume 2. I am ready for it. It's like every time you turn a corner in this city, well, here I am on City Corner. Every time you turn a corner here, there's another story just waiting to be told.
Was it these things hard to research or not?
Some, but we have wonderful resources here, and our St. Louis Public Library has phenomenal collections and the basement of City Hall.
Well, NiNi, your book is great. This used to be St. Louis Reedy Press. Go to reedypress.com or NiNiHarris.com to find out more about that. And I know you'll be back on the show one of these days as soon as the second edition of this book comes out or whatever your next project is.
Thank you.
NiNi Harris, always good to talk to you. Reedy Press, be sure and pick it up. This used to be St. Louis. I'm Steve Potter. Thanks for watching City Corner, and join us next time.